Hey folks, Tyler here. So in this video, we're getting hands-on with the AWS Identity Access Management, or IAM service. Now, the IAM service allows us to create and manage identities within our AWS account. So in this video, we'll take a look at users, groups, and roles. Now, if you're at all familiar, or unfamiliar, I should say, with the AWS IAM service, I have another video that dives deeper into an understanding of how it all works, how authentication, authorization works, and all that. So let's go ahead and dive into the AWS console here. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a user, and we'll give the user a name. We'll call it Bob. So optionally, we can give Bob access to the AWS Management Console, meaning that Bob would be able to log in just like I am here within the browser to AWS. I'm going to go ahead and leave this unchecked. And then here is where we can define the permissions that Bob has. At this time, I'm also going to just leave this alone and hit next. And then we'll create the user. All right, so we have Bob as a user here, no permissions, no groups, and then security credentials. We can go and create access keys. Now, access keys give us programmatic access into AWS. And as you might see here, AWS recommends some alternatives to access keys. Now, the reason for this is access keys are not secure. They are long-term credentials, much like username and passwords. And usually what happens with these credentials is they need to be stored somewhere, and they end up on public GitHubs or your laptop or in a whole bunch of different places. Basically, they can become compromised, and they're not rotated automatically. So unless you've realized that they're compromised, someone has access to your account. So we'll go ahead and create those access keys. Now we can see the access keys one time here. So again, like I was saying, don't expose these. You're going to see them because I'm showing this as a demo. So we have the access keys. I'm going to flip over to the console here, and then we're going to go ahead and set up our access keys. So AWS configure, we'll paste in the access key ID there, and then we'll get the secrets and we'll paste that in here. We can define a default region if we want, which means anytime we run these AWS commands, it's going to use this region unless we've changed it with a parameter. And then we can also change the output format. I like JSON, so we'll keep that there. And then what we can do here is AWS STS, and we'll run the get caller identity command, and this will tell us exactly who we are. So we can see that we've successfully authenticated to AWS as this user Bob. Now, because Bob has no permissions, I'm not able to actually run anything. We can see that we're access denied when calling list roles, because Bob is not authorized to perform list roles because no identity-based policy allows the list roles action. And again, going back to the console here, we have no permissions. So we could give Bob permissions here, but that's not best practice to give users permissions like that. So what we'll do instead is we'll go and we'll create a group. So I'm going to create a new group, and we could call this group engineering. And then we could give it whatever permission policy we want. We have some AWS out-of-the-box policies here. We could also specify like our own policies as well. I don't have those set up, so we'll just go ahead and grant one of the AWS policies. And then we'll add Bob to this group here. Now, after I select it, add Bob to the engineering group. So again, we can see that Bob has the permission administrator access attached via this group engineering. All right, so now if I go back to the AWS console, and let's try to, I'll clear the screen first. We'll try to rerun that command. Now we can actually run commands because now we have permissions, all thanks to that group. Now, if I go back here, we'll go into the group, and then if I remove Bob from the group, and then we'll go back to Bob first. We can see that Bob now has no permissions, and he's also not in any groups. So we'll flip back to the terminal here, clear the screen, try to rerun that command. Now we'll get this error message, not authorized, because again, we have no permissions. So that's the benefit of having groups. giving users permissions via groups that they're a member of. All right, so let's hop into roles now. And then as you can see here, you probably have a whole bunch of roles. There's a bunch of like ones for AWS services. I'm going to go and create a new role. And then in this case, roles can be assumed by services, different accounts, SAML, web identity for like OpenID Connect and things like that. We're going to do a custom trust policy because I want my user Bob to assume this role. And so what we're going to do here is we can see that, so the std is just kind of like an identifier for this statement. That's actually optional. I'm just going to remove that. So we're going to say allow, and then we need to specify a principal here. So I'm going to first copy my account ID because that's going to be needed. And then we'll add a principal. And as you can see here, because this is a role, roles can be assumed by the root user, IAM roles, sessions, etc. What we want for Bob, since Bob's an IAM user, we'll select IAM users here. And then we have this ARN here. Now we can't just hit add principal, so we have to know what we want. So the account is our account ID, and then the username of Bob was Bob. Now, if we didn't know that, we can flip back to the console here and rerun that sts-getCaller identity command. We can see that user Bob. We could also just copy this ARN like so, flip back to the console, and then if I paste it, it's the exact same thing. So we'll add the principal there. Okay, so now we're saying allow the principal Bob from this account the ability to assume the role. All right. Now, that's really all we need. It would be good practice, though, to specify conditions. And there's a whole bunch of different conditions that we can use. There's global condition keys, which means that they can apply to any policy. And then we also have service level specific condition keys. So for example, if we were doing like OpenID Connect with identity providers, we could specify some additional service level keys for things like Amazon or Facebook and Google, etc. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and hit cancel. And then we'll go ahead and hit next here. And then now the role needs a permission set. So we could give it, it's not good to do administrator access. This is just a demo here. So we'll give it administrator access. I'll hit next. And then we'll give it a role name. And we can name this role maybe developers. Okay. So here's the trust policy. Bob can assume this role. We add permissions to it. We create role here. All right, so now we have this role developers. Okay. So now, as we saw before with Bob, Bob's not able to, do anything. We don't have permissions because we're no longer in that group. So instead, what we can do is now assume the role. So we'll do AWS STS. So this is going to call that STS endpoint, which is regional. And then we will do assume, I misspell it, assume role. And then it's role name, ARN. So now we'll hop back to the console. We'll get the ARN here of the developer role that we just made. We'll paste that there. And then it's like role session name. So this is just essentially for logging. It could be whatever we wanted here. We can do, Bob Dev. And then there's some other parameters we can specify. For example, we can specify how long we want access to the role, as well as some other things here. I'm just going to go ahead and leave it as is. And then here we go. We get credentials return for the role. So if you watch the previous video where we kind of talked about this, theory-wise, we are the user Bob, and then we hit this STS endpoint and we said, hey, I want to assume this role. And because Bob is allowed to assume the role based on the role's trust policy, the STS service returns us credentials as we see here. Now, these credentials are short-term credentials. So you may notice that there's an access key ID and a secret access key, just like we would with a user, But now there's this new credential type, session token. And this session token is basically our temporary credentials here. So what we want to do is we'll set up these credentials to now use the role. So I'm going to specify a profile, because if I just do sts configure, it's going to overwrite my credentials as Bob. And what I mean by that is if we look at our credentials file here, the default credentials that we have set up, these are for Bob. Okay, so this is like our default profile. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a new profile. We just do -- profile. I'll name it Bob Dev. Again, it can be whatever we wanted here. We could put Sally if we wanted to, but we'll do Bob Dev. Maybe Bob Dev role, just so we know. And then we can do configure. And then it's going to ask us for that access key ID, just like we would with a user. We'll copy that, and then it'll ask us for the session key, or sorry, the secret key. Paste that. Region name, we could just leave these blank if we wanted to. All right, so now if we try to use the Bob Dev role, let's see if it works. So we get this error message, invalid client token, and that's because we didn't specify the session token. So we're going to copy this session token here, and then we are going to run AWS profile Bob Dev, and then in this case we'll run configure, and then set AWS session token, and then just paste in that session token just like that. All right, so now if we run AWS profile Bob Dev role, sts get caller identity, this will work. And we now have access to the role developers. And so now we can, I'm going to clear the screen here. We can run any permission we want because we're the administrator. So we could do, EC2 describe instances. I don't have any EC2 running, so this will not return anything. And of course, you have to specify a region. And if you remember, when we set up this role, we didn't specify a default region. So now I have to specify whatever region I want here. And then there we go. Because I have no EC2s, nothing gets returned. But we could very well enumerate IAM. We can see that we have the user Bob there. So now, if we look at that credentials file here, we can see that we have this default profile, which was Bob. And then we have this Bob Dev role, which is our developer role. So that's basically it. So we've got users, groups, and roles, and we ran through how to set up both of those. Now, there's no cost to creating these. So if you did follow along, no worries, you can leave them running, although it's always best practice to clean up after yourself. So hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll talk to you next time.